Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another InvestorCom webinar. We're excited to host you today to talk about what everyone's been waiting to talk about, which is the 2026 compliance priorities. Perhaps you can expect more, perhaps you can expect less, but as a collective, I'm sure we can prepare for the year ahead, given our panelists here today. Before we get started, we are recording today's conversation and plan to share it with you. And we're delighted that you're sharing it, you're joining us today. A few housekeeping matters around the point that we are recording today's conversation. And if you are an IACCP designated credit holder, charter holder, you will be able to apply for a CE credit. All you have to do is share proof of attendance of today's session, and you'll be able to be eligible for that credit. All right. As I mentioned, we welcome all of your questions throughout today's discussion. We'll have plenty of time dedicated at the last 15 minutes of today's conversation to take up any questions that you might have. Having said that, let's jump in and introduce our agenda and get into a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. But let's begin with the panelists first, if my computer cooperates here. And I'll pass it over to you, Tom, for a quick intro.
Thanks, Tom. My name is Tom Selman. I'm a former executive at FINRA. Now I'm president and CEO of Scopus Financial Group, a consulting firm that provides regulatory guidance to the industry and provides expert testimony as well for both consumers and industries or litigants.
Excellent. Thank you. Anna?
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Petrovich. I am a director with Kroll in its regulatory consulting practice. Prior to joining Kroll, I served for over a decade at the SEC in the Division of Enforcement and served as a leader in the Complex Financial Instrument Specialty Unit.
Thank you, Anna. And we'll do a quick sound check for Mahtab. Does it work? Still can't hear you, Mahtab. We'll come back to you, Mahtab. I'll pass it over to David.
Yeah, hey, Dave Kalita from Evershed Sutherland, where I've been a partner for 5 months, relatively new to the firm. I've been doing this a while. I was at the Groom Law Group for 12 years, Alston & Bird, another large general practice firm, for 9, and then I worked at the Vanguard Group for 8 years. And my specialty really is focusing on how ERISA and the Internal Revenue Code apply to financial products and services. So most of my practice is really focused on ERISA and the code from the perspective of financial services providers, whether broker-dealers, insurance companies, or RIAs, et cetera.
Excellent. Thank you, David. We'll come back to Mahtab to see if the sound's working. It's not a good webinar if we don't have some form of technical challenges. Once, twice. Maybe I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Param, and I'll be your host for today's conversation. For those who haven't come across InvestorCom, we are a leading software provider for wealth managers across North America, and our award-winning platform is known for its proudly simple solutions that help eliminate compliance pain, as well as risks, and foster growth for our respective clients. Maybe in the interest of keeping the discussion going, Mahtab, jump in at any point in time and say a few words, and we can kind of go back and get a bit of a introduction into your background. But with that said, let's jump into the agenda for today. The intention is to talk about 2026 priorities. Having said that, to give that conversation context, we're going to start with a 2025 year in review. It's been a volatile and a surprising year on many fronts, and We'll begin and ask our panelists for a reflection of what really surprised them in 25, and then looking forward and jumping into 2026. What can firms do? What can wealth practitioners do to ensure that they have a compliant practice, their selling practices, all the way down to, we'll call it crypto and AI, everything's buttoned up. And then obviously, more recently, a few days ago, we had the SEC's 2026 exam priorities published. So it wouldn't be a good conversation unless we jam that into the mix. So thank you to our panelists who are A-OK for beginning that conversation with us. And then, as I said off the top, plenty of time. Please engage. We already had a flood of questions coming in for our panelists. So as you see fit, as we're going through the discussion, feel free to enter your questions into the chat, and I see that's already been quite active. Okay, so my first question was going to be for Mahtab, but I see there is a sound glitch, so maybe we pivot and let's just jump into the next question and talk a little bit. Anna, you're my next target, if that's okay. From your lens, having been in the enforcement division of the SEC, any items that took place in 2025, specifically around sales practices that surprised you?
Sure, Param. I would say that there still tends to be a keen focus on disclosure and making sure the disclosures truly reflect actual practices. So something as simple as saying you may do something versus you do something could be a difference of an enforcement action. And so understanding that this administration still pursued those cases definitely took me a little bit by surprise, not necessarily so under the past administrations. I would say too that, in terms of resources and priorities, there tends to be a greater emphasis on the big picture, right? In terms of not just looking at a particular sale or recommendation, but the entire program, right? How is the firm's culture set up? What are the controls in place? What kind of disclosures are made? What is the record keeping? And all of that is taken into account, and not only whether there's an exam deficiency, enforcement action, but what the remedies would be. In other words, penalties, independent compliance consultants, and the like.
Yeah, absolutely. That sort of holistic picture is sort of what's also resonating in terms of what's coming out in the 2026 priorities. So that's a really good point. What about David on the I'll call it the back and forth in terms of expectations around the fiduciary standards and where the DOL was effectively situated in 2025? Anything come to mind? Any reflections of 25 as it relates to that?
Yeah, well, certainly there's a lot of turmoil at the Department of Labor, just like every other agency that we've seen in the federal government. So, unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of. They have taken some actions, but in the areas around what we want to talk about today, which is PTE 2022 and advice and things like that, there hasn't been a lot. That was partly due because Daniel Aronowitz, who is the Assistant Secretary in charge of Employee Benefit Security Administration, he wasn't confirmed until September 18th, I believe, and then less than 2 weeks later, they shut the government down. So he hasn't really had a lot of opportunity to get things going on the regulatory agenda, which would include the definition of investment advice. But yeah, definitely for folks on the call, it was kind of this year. So what do we do now? I mean, there was a lot of questions around that. And a lot of that was driven by the litigation against the Department of Labor's efforts to expand the definition of investment advice. And that's occurred in two different ways. One was through its prohibited transaction exemption 2020-02, which I'll refer to as 2002 a lot, which basically said that a rollover recommendation from a plan or even from an IRA or a transfer recommendation to another account that's qualified like an IRA would be the first or could be the first recommendation of an ongoing advice relationship or investment management relationship if you're going to do discretionary management. And thus, that recommendation to roll over would in fact be advice. And that was a major change. And then there was this other and by the way, I think people kind of forget that came out during the Trump administration. So that is not a creature of the Biden administration. The Biden administration, on the other hand, when they got into office, tried to revamp the definition of investment advice again, much like they did back in 2015, maybe not quite as broadly, but pretty darn close. And then tried to funnel everybody into this PTE 2020-02 exemption. So what and kind of pushed aside a lot of the exemptions that folks rely on, particularly the insurance industry. So they were subject to legal challenges, both. The PTE 2020-02, there was a Q&A that described how it applied, and that got shot down by the Middle District of Florida, a district court. But that court didn't address 2002, and then another court, Northern District of Texas, actually upheld the Department of Labor's interpretation within PTE 2020-02. In other words, they just said that the DOL had the authority to do that. The retirement security rule is being litigated right now, and whether it's and that's kind of in limbo because of the change in administration. We're kind of waiting to see what happens. I think most of us think it'll go away pretty soon, but that still is an open question.
Excellent, David. It sounds a lot more clear when it comes from you, given that you practice in the space. I got to tell you, across our client base, industry friends, I was just recently at a compliance conference, and the ambiguity around the 2020-02 applicability and the confusion between that as well as the retirement security rule is paramount. So I really appreciate your clarity to the conversation and the fact that 2020-02 is still in play and compliance is an expectation. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I have heard that, but I would say, at least the larger firms in this space, they have not abandoned 2002 compliance. They may be revisiting it a bit in 2026, but maybe the level of compliance or how they comply, things like that. But they definitely have not they haven't felt secure enough to say that this has gone away.
Yeah, excellent. One other quick observation on that point, and it's predominantly been what we've seen across our client base. To be transparent, initially when 2020-02 came into play, there was a bit of a what I like to call like sort of a bug spray reaction, in that, okay, let's just pretend, let's assume it doesn't exist and it'll go away at some point. And then gradually over time, what we've seen, at least across Investor Comp's client base, has been a shift in, can you really assume 5,000 rollovers were executed through your firm and not a single ounce of advice was provided, and they were all educational exercises? So we are seeing that shift. We are seeing that optionality being provided to advisors to consummate business effectively, right? And avoid any sort of, I'll call it, further confusion as a result of some of those kind of sales practices. Tom, maybe what I really love that you bring to our conversations is really a common sense approach between the yins and the yangs, the ups and downs in terms of what we're seeing in regulatory pressure one day, and then perhaps maybe some of those pressures are dialing away. What's been your reflection of 2025?
Well, maybe it's a sign of my age, but I remember I was a young securities lawyer when Ronald Reagan took office, and people thought at the time, well, that's the end of securities enforcement, exams of firms, everything's going to shut down now because he's opposed to regulation. In fact, what happened then, I think, is probably going to be similar to what happens now, which is that, and Chairman Atkins at the SEC has indicated as much, that the focus will be on the bread and butter type issues: fraud, abusive sales practices, that type of thing. So the kind of creative enforcement and litigation that Chairman Gensler undertook, frankly, many of which efforts were struck down in the circuit courts, both in rulemaking and enforcement. I think those efforts will probably go by the wayside. So I think you'll see a great deal of emphasis on the bread and butter issues. During the Reagan administration, for example, we had the tremendous cases against people who are engaged in insider trading. The Drexel cases, the Michael Milken case, those were all in the Reagan administration because those were basic schemes that were fraudulent and harmed the market. And I think you're going to see something similar today. So I think what that means is that Reg BI will still be enforced and maybe at least as vigorously as I think as it was under the Gensler administration, because now a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been removed. You know, the obvious disclosure failures by some firms, those have been more or less addressed. So I think what you're going to see are some real sales practice type issues that were under Reg BI, and I think the SEC will continue to treat Reg BI as a quasi fiduciary standard. So rollover considerations, comparisons between products, fees, conflicts, all those things will continue to be a big issue.
I should have bet money on this, Tom, that you're gonna go back in time and give us one of those common sense and time-stamped examples that sort of brings us back to reality. Thank you. Mahtab, you were supposed to be the first question here. Maybe do a quick sound check and maybe from a practitioner's perspective, what was your reflection in 25?
Well, first of all, hello. I hope you can hear me. Excellent. Thank you. When technology fails to cooperate, it really fails to cooperate. I apologize for that. Thrilled to be here. Compliance Director, Retail Registered Investment Advisor in New York. I think that'll suffice for now. I don't know what I've missed because we were trying to work the technology, but I think in terms of current trends, I don't like trends so much because my philosophy around compliance is always, we know what the framework is to a large extent, with or without its imperfections. We're always striving to make sure that we're building a business on a solid regulatory framework. So we have, as I love Tom's bread and butter expression, the bread and butter of investment advisory never changes through cycles. I've also been through a number of cycles, and I think what stays top of mind always is, are you getting the basics right? Do you have your compliance program, your risk assessments all lined up, ticked and tied? And I think we still have a lot of food for thought. I think we all sighed a big sigh of relief thinking, oh, thank goodness the regulatory agenda lightened a little bit. But we're still all grappling with the sort of new rules. Reg SB, obviously, less than 2 weeks away. Sounded like it was going to be a very easy breezy implementation, but obviously, as they say, the devil is in the details. So as we're implementing, we're trying to make sure that it's operationalized correctly. I don't know if there's anything that you guys were discussing that I'm repeating, I apologize, but I think from a practitioner's perspective, disclosures are the backbone of everything we're doing. The documentation, which we're going to talk about some more, I don't think that there's been that much of a different pressure on it. Again, that's the litigator in me thinking always, if you can't evidence what you're doing, then there may be a problem. So that's where I'm at right now.
Excellent. Thank you, Mahtab, and your sound is on point. So are your points. I wasn't planning to say it that way, but let's jam forward. I mean, appreciate everyone's reflections of 25. It has been it has been unprecedented because of the ups and downs in terms of direction, but I love the common sense approach that you're bringing to the conversation. One factor that actually came up in our prep conversations was the fact that enforcement activity, if you were to look at that number in absolute terms, is down. Are you finding, as you're speaking with your clients, how are sort of the practitioners reacting to that? Is it sort of, all right, let's turn the lights off and assume those regulations don't exist? Or is it more of a, hey, there's a little bit of breathing room here and we should tidy up our practices? Maybe Anna, I could come to you for that question.
Sure, absolutely. I think the first natural reaction is a little bit of relief of, okay, we're no longer behind the ball. But I think the second step is let's take advantage of this time to clean up potential gaps and get ahead and really focus on enhancing compliance programs. And I've had a number of clients ask me a very similar question. And my former enforcement hat is, well, what you do today per a statute of limitations is still enforceable 5 years from now, right? And so you may have a completely different mindset of an administration. And then my cynical hat is telling me, in fact, you may get some leaders that say, who tried to take advantage of this environment, and therefore we're going to do a sweep or whatnot. And so back to Matab's point, the laws haven't changed, right? So some of the rules didn't go through, but the laws remain the same, and you have an obligation to comply. And so I think, fortunately, most of our clients have taken that view of let's take advantage, let's roll up our sleeves, and keep our, foot on the gas pedal.
Wonderful. Any other thoughts across the panel on 25 and sort of the enforcement pressures or lack thereof?
On the Department of Labor side, I don't think people realize what they do actually enforce ERISA against and service providers. So I've done a lot of investigations with broker dealers and RIAs. There usually has to be a fiduciary type connection, but a lot of dual registrants and things like that. And they certainly cut back this year, just because they got rid of so many people. So the enforcement staff is much smaller. They had not been looking at 2002 intentionally because the thought was this was more of they wanted to encourage compliance and not ding a lot of people. And the question is, would that change now in this current environment? Who knows? But at the end of the day, the reality is there are just less people there to do the work. So I would assume that would carry over for the next couple of years at least. That doesn't mean you shouldn't comply. It just means, practically speaking, they may not be knocking on your door as much as they would be.
This is an excellent point, David, and I think it's a good segue into turning the page and helping our audience here, think about how to prioritize, how to bucket things in 26. And I think there are some emerging trends in the industry, and I think the study that was recently published by SIFMA and KPMG talks about maybe some demographic changes around the adoption and the demand for digital tools, the level of trust in the profession, and the dependency across different generations on advisors. On that point, maybe the other regulator we need to talk about here as well is FINRA. And Tom, maybe we can ask you that question. Are you seeing any different sort of headwinds at FINRA, any specific policies that our audience should be aware of?
Well, FINRA, as everybody probably knows, FINRA is the self-regulatory organization for the broker-dealer industry. So that takes the investment advisor industry off the table for a second, just for purposes of this, what I'm about to say. And FINRA more or less follows the direction of the general direction of the SEC. After all, it's regulated by the SEC. So, for example, FINRA adopted what is called FINRA Forward, which is essentially a review of all of its regulatory programs to see how they're operating. I mean, I have to admit, I was at FINRA for 24 years, and it seemed like we did a review every other year, and it was always as if we'd never done one before. But this is another one that was announced in April this year, and I don't think that's surprising because the new administration had come in, and there was obviously a lot of interest at the SEC level in looking at how rules are being adopted, how matters are being enforced, the exam program at the SEC. So FINRA is engaged in the same kind of review. And enforcement is a focus. As a matter of fact, I think the enforcement program, I believe, is the only program in this FINRA Forward effort in which FINRA has brought in 2 outside experts to look at the program. They brought in Troy Paredes and Paul Eckert. Troy Paredes is the former SEC commissioner. He actually replaced Paul Atkins when Paul Atkins was a commissioner. He's appointed by President Bush. And Paul Eckert was a former Bush assistant during the Bush administration, later practiced law at WilmerHale. So you have people probably of a bit more conservative bent looking at the enforcement program. My understanding is FINRA will announce eventually, they're getting close to, I think they're getting close to the results, which they'll give to their board and then announce the results, at least generally to the public. FINRA is also under some legal pressure. There have been some circuit court decision, one circuit court decision in particular that limited its enforcement authority a bit on constitutional grounds. And they're currently in litigation in the Sixth Circuit on a different constitutional issue. So there's a lot swirling about FINRA, but I think in general, it's kind of a long-winded answer, but I think in general, to answer your question, what you see in general direction at the SEC is going to be similar to what you see at FINRA.
That's a good point. Really good point, Tom. Thank you. And so maybe let's flip that onto the practitioner side, Mahtab. When you look at some parts of the conversations today, the 2026 statement of exam priorities from the SEC, what types of investments, what types of strategic conversations are you having from a practitioner's perspective?
So, not surprisingly, there's a lot of discussion around automation and technology. I really feel that whilst like really good technology is a differentiator, it's table stakes. I know that, you know, there's many different size and models for sort of businesses, and I sort of right now focusing more on investment advisory practice. But there is technology, there are tools available now to help with audit trail, automated deliveries of, you know, various required materials, disclosures, but also to help to take out some of the risk in the system. So we're very lucky at our firm. We have an amazing technology team who, you know, build for us things that we need. And I recognize that's really a privilege to have. And depending on budget allocations or resources available, it may not always be possible. Like we work a lot with dashboards, live dashboards. We're continually evolving the way we are receiving information. Starting point has always been making sure we have clean, good data. Data integrity is integral to having the kind of reportability and the sort of ability to identify issues, perhaps even proactively, and not after the event reviews. So I think those are tools that we find extremely useful. And doubling down on automation and technology, I think, is going to be really important going forward. My head spins when I think of the pace with which we're advancing. We're all talking about artificial intelligence, perhaps not even fully understanding natural intelligence, and we're leaping to artificial, but that's a whole other subject that we can sort of get very philosophical about. Again, just going back, like the enforcement trends that we were speaking about, sometimes they are administration agnostic. So marketing rule, I think, is probably administration agnostic. Fiduciary standard, investment advisor standard of conduct. These are things where technology, talent, the right talent in the right seats to be able to connect dots, identify issues, partner up with your business partners to make sure that you're able to address quickly and effectively, deepening your knowledge of the business that you're supporting. I think all of those will feed into your ability to, as I like to always say, exam-proof your business. And when I say that, I always mean that we're not aiming to not get dinged, but if you're doing business the right way, if you're looking to guidance and the lead from your regulators, compliance is absolutely every single time a business developer, a business enabler in my mind. So focusing on the priorities does help with shepherding businesses through some of these changes and requirements.
100%. So well said, Atab. The point about compliance being a business enabler is something that triggers what we've experienced at our shop. And historically, anytime compliance technology is being adopted at firms, it's almost like, historically it's been a point of friction. And what our challenge has been trying to take that as an opportunity to change the conversation where compliance technology, if it's simple enough, if it's easy enough to adopt, and it becomes a core pillar of strength to protect the advisory practice. When documentation is difficult, why not just make it a click away? And why not make it automated in today's day and age, as opposed to, everyone's trying to jump to, AI and to your point, let's get the data correct. Let's make sure we have clean data. Let's make sure we have clean records and consistent records across the business. So if Parm's making a product recommendation, it shouldn't foundationally be a different process if it's Anna on the other side of the business. So that's actually something that compliance as a business enabler. And David, maybe I'll come to you on this point about the evolution of what we've been seeing on the rollover recommendation side, specifically LPL. Has really helped us re-envision that question around, well, the optionality that these folks in the marketplace are now going to have between, hey, we're just going to shut down rollover recommendations and educate our clients, versus the advisors are now going to have the option to say, hey, maybe perhaps at some point in time, I'm going to educate my investors. Other points in time, maybe I can dig in a little bit more and provide them with that foundational advice where there is value for the advisor and converge that retirement into the wealth practice. Having said that, are you seeing that trend at all in your practice where the education onlys are moving perhaps to a more of a recommendation liberal path?
Yeah, I think a lot of my firms, even clients that I work with, from the beginning, really hold themselves out as full service financial services companies, or they're wealth managers. So there's no reason to say that, okay, well, we're not going to provide you advice in one area and not in another. It just doesn't work well with their whole business proposition. So, I certainly had a number of those. But I did have others that felt that education only was the way to go, or at least they offered the option of both. And I think, without a doubt, technology helps with that. I think one of the biggest challenges is, and you already alluded to this, is, okay, we're education only, but by some miracle, everyone who was told about their distribution options wound up rolling over. Like that seems kind of suspicious. And I think a lot of firms of mine they're realizing that maybe they need to revisit this, and say, okay, well, 2002 does provide us a mechanism. We still have to do this for Reg BI and the Advisors Act, say something along those lines. So maybe it just makes sense to just do it and truly be full service. So, and maybe that's a little bit, okay, we are in a lower enforcement environment probably. So, maybe they feel more comfortable. But I think in the end, it's more about the customer service aspects of it. And I think they see this as an opportunity to distinguish themselves by willing to provide advice throughout the relationship. And without a doubt, I mean, if you watch in the merger acquisition activity, there are institutional managers that never would have deigned to play in the retail space have now, acquired retail side advisors and stuff, because they realize this is all integrated, and that is the best way, one, to build a business, but two, to serve their clients. So, but if you're going to do that, then you have to probably comply with 2002 and Reg BI and the things that you maybe not want to have to comply with, but that's the better customer experience at the end of the day.
Such a good point, David. And we're seeing a similar trend in what's being coined as the wealth management convergence of retirement and the wealth practice. And it just makes so much common sense, as well as the advisor truly being able to care for the investor's assets, as opposed to sort of the bifurcated way that was traditionally, well, you've got your 401k plan assets somewhere else, and I'll just pretend it doesn't exist, and I'll manage your money on this isolated bucket. It's sort of part and parcel of the portfolio management theory all the way down to best interest practices. So it's very, very timely. And in fact, this is another good segue. And Anna, maybe I can come to you on what a lot of folks in our virtual room was asking about, which was the 2026 exam priorities. I'm sure you've read through it. You haven't had much time. Anything that stood out to you from that?
Sure. I think really the emphasis was on complex products or products that lack liquidity, and then retail investors. And these go hand in hand, because if we look at the markets now, there's been a push to offer up these complex products to the retail investor market, which is an opportunity from a business standpoint, but it does raise the risk from a compliance and regulatory standpoint. And so I think it really is telling that the exam division, with limited resources today, right after what happened earlier this year, has front and center listed this as an examination priority. And so I really think the takeaway for firms today is just reiterating, if you have retail clients or you offer a complex product, which is defined pretty broadly, then you really, really need to be aware of the unique risks that arise as a result of that. I think the other thing that stood out to me was, the Reg SP compliance. And so, I support clients through SEC exams routinely. And even before the compliance date has taken effect, we routinely get questions of how are you preparing for this implementation. And to Matab's point, supporting clients through that, it's a much more uphill battle than I think the industry realized. So I'm not entirely surprised that the exam staff announced that, but if Reg SP has not been on your radar, even if you're a smaller firm, would prioritize that in the coming year.
Reg SP, it's on everyone's mind. And in fact, it trickles down to technology companies like ours who are supporting and partnering with wealth practitioner firms. It is a partnership, and I believe it's sort of the underlying spirit of it is exactly where we want to be as an industry. On those points, maybe Tom, from your perspective, as you're sort of looking at the exam priorities from the SEC, it's sort of a common playbook from what FINRA comes out with next. How can firms rise to the challenge, and where does technology, in your opinion, fits in the mix of that?
Well, I think as everybody said, and I think as most people understand, technology is going to continue to be important. I mean, if you look at the technology that was used even 10 years ago in a lot of firms, particularly retail firms, it's changed quite a bit. I think the key to technology, though, particularly the technology that's going to be adopted by your sales force, is to have fairly simple technology. So a platform that doesn't require a lot of separate decision making but beyond the decision making that's relevant to the compliance question, doesn't require a lot of steps to go through. Anything that discourages its use or complicates its use or confuses the outcome is just not very helpful. So technology, it goes without saying that firms need technology to address these issues, but I think it's even more important to consider the simple technology that can be widely used within the firm.
Tom, that's our principal value at InvestorCom. It's got to be proudly simple. It's got to be intuitive. Otherwise, the interests don't align. I can tell you from what we've observed in the industry, there's been in-house solutions that I'll say are probably compliant every which way under any regime possible, except the advisors don't want to use it. And that's effectively ended up drying out business because it's created a bottleneck. Who wants to go through a 7-page manual PDF form? I don't. I don't know many people who enjoy that, whether they're educating their investor or providing holistic advice, to Dave's point. So, and I think the advent of technology and the most difficult thing of building good technology is making sure it's intuitive, making sure it's meeting the objectives of compliance with the spirit of the law, of the regulations, but also helping those advisors nudge their business forward and truly help their investors. I just got to be careful I don't get too high on my soapbox here. As a reasonable host, let me just throw out, we're coming up unbelievably on the 45-minute mark. So folks, if you have questions for our panelists, this is the time. We're going to be transitioning to sort of some foundational practice related questions. And we are going to collate your questions and tackle them in a few minutes. So jump in as you see fit. Now, Mahtab, since you've been patient with us, and we probably missed peppering you with a few questions in the beginning. We'll try it now. What's one business conduct process that, in your opinion, should be standardized, and how are you using that as an impetus to plan for 2026?
Oof, I struggled with this question. I think usually the simplest answers are the right one. I see that as disclosure delivery. And I struggled with that question because we had a baptism of fire with COVID and Reg BI. And I think a lot of firms really opened their hearts and minds to digitizing a lot of things, including electronic signatures, including, Form CRS delivery was one of the big ones, right? So that's what I think is an absolute must-have at our current state. I have a nice to have that I would like to throw out there, and this came out of a conversation with a dear colleague. Anything that can automate potential fraud detection. We have a lot of different ways of flagging suspicious activity, and I know banks do this really well. But in our practices, automating a process which would help our senior investors not fall prey to fraudulent transactions is something I'd love to hear more about.
Yeah, automation, AI, false positives, reducing false positives, they're all hot topics at the moment. And I think to your point earlier, Mahtab, that you got to have clean data. It really starts with digitize that function, ensure there's clean data, ensure that there's consistent practices. And then after that, I mean, you've got the building block. And I think that's where the additional layer of AI and natural language processing can come in to simplify streams and streams and loads of data downstream as a result of it. But that's just my opinion. Any other thoughts on that point for our panels? Lovely. I see some questions coming in. Maybe this is a good juncture for me to jump in on those. There is a question around rollovers, and specifically, thank you for that. I'm just reading it through quickly. For firms who provide advice on the rollover side, how can one mitigate issues that are related to the annual retrospective testing? If, for example, issues are found, how can those be corrected? And specifically, if there was a discovery that the process wasn't followed 100%. David, maybe I could come to you on that point.
Yeah, so I assume this person is alluding to under PT 2020-02. If you fail to comply, then you can correct it, and you may not figure out, that you had a mistake until or a failure to comply until you do your retroactive review. There is an annual review required, but I think I encourage firms, depending on the volume of transactions they do, maybe do it more frequently because it's easier to deal with these like every quarter or semi-annually than annually. But that said, there is this mechanism for fixing. I mean, it could be tricky with rollovers because at the end of the day, the money is out of a plan odds are the plan's not going to take it back. So you're kind of stuck with it. But what I do is say, okay, can we come up with a reasonable form of correction? For instance, let's go back. Do we have any way, can we go back and see that our recommendation would have been in fact a rollover? So can we back into it? And I mean this genuinely. In other words, we can look at it and based on all the data, that would have been an appropriate recommendation. In those cases, we might be willing to just move forward, or we'll say to the client, look, we technically should have given you this disclosure based on what we see here. I forgot, sorry. Here it is now. If you have a problem with it, let me know. And more often than not, especially if you email it to them or something, you'll never hear from them. And then you move on and you kind of do it in a negative consent kind of way. So you can deal with it. More often than, I mean, I've never had a situation where they came back and said, oh, well, if I would have known this, I never would have rolled over. So that covers a lot of the issues. Another issue, sometimes you forget to send the disclosures. Again, you just send them out again. The big question I get is, should we report it to the DOL? Practitioners are divided on this. Honestly, I think there's little harm in it because the DOL doesn't know what to do with it anyway. Quite frankly, it just goes into some email inbox and it's all good. Nobody's going to say anything. But you could come up with creative arguments or maybe why you don't have to.
There's the mute button. Thank you, David. You're on the hot seat. You're getting back-to-back questions, my friend. There's been an acknowledgement that the topic has been excellent and the covering SEC and FINRA priorities for 26 has worked really well. David, what about the ERISA compliance priorities for 2026? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think, with this new administration and its priorities, I mean, I think this this idea of alternative investments is a big issue. I'm dealing with it with my clients now on the asset management side. So I think we're going to see some guidance around that. And, the challenge with ERISA is they could issue all the guidance they want, but at the end of the day, you can get sued under ERISA. There is a lot of, there's a litigation risk here that you can't ignore. Unless this administration or Congress somehow changes the law in this regard, that is something we're going to have to live with. So we hope that we'll see the Department of Labor really issue some regulatory guidance, maybe even safe harbor guidance around some of the issues on adding these kinds of investments to the plan. So I think that'll be coming out. Lifetime income is definitely a hot topic, which sometimes because of the executive order gets lumped in with alternative assets, but it's not really. It's just, but these kinds of products and including them in plans, whether it's standalone investments or part of collective investment trusts, I still think firms need. What I've seen is this trend, which I kind of alluded to before, but even retail, what I would call retail advisors, are getting into the ERISA plan business. So not just at the participant level, but at the plan level as well, which is fine. I mean, that's great. But then you have to be able to manage the conflicts, particularly around the rollover advice and things like that. If you have proprietary products, mutual funds, insurance products, et cetera, and you're going to be recommending them. And you really have to be aware of the prohibited transaction provisions because disclosure more often than not is not sufficient. So I think firms, if they're going to keep up, they're going to move more into this role where they're going to be providing plan level advice as well, whether it's a cash balance plan, 401k plan. And so they have to build compliance policies and procedures and practices both at the firm level and at the advisor level that fit within and require compliance with ERISA. Because again, you can get sued under ERISA, so that and for damages. So you need to be very aware of your processes and procedures. So those are some of the things that I'm working with clients on now for 2026.
Yeah, Parm, I don't know if you have time, but I wanted to echo what David was saying on the ERISA side of it, alternative investments. That's an area of my practice. And I think just as David indicated that DOL is working to figure out how some guidance can be provided about allowing alternative investments in different ways than they are now in 401k plans. But the litigation risk still exists, that you still can get sued, obviously, under ERISA. Something similar, I think, is happening at the SEC, because probably the most frequently made comment on the 2026 priorities piece, the exam piece, is the absence of digital assets. The last few, I believe, have singled out digital assets for examinations. It's not in here now. It's a separate category. But again, I think that's an indication that just as DOL is trying to figure out how alternative investments might be more easily brought into defined contribution plans, I think at the SEC, there's obviously an effort to try to understand the application of securities laws and give guidance to digital assets. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to get examined in your digital asset business, or that you're not going to be subject to a suit by the SEC if your sales practices aren't appropriate. So it's a very similar process, I think.
And I'll add, in the executive order, digital assets is considered an alternative asset. Again, alternative assets was incredibly broad. They kind of threw everything in. Yeah. I don't think any alternative asset manager would think digital assets is in their world, or vice versa. But that said, I'm not sure it's a bad thing either. It just means the DOL is going to issue guidance that's helpful all around. That's theoretically. But what I will point out is that digital assets is tricky in both ERISA plans and IRAs, and it's not just, whether it's prudent to have investments like that in a plan, but it's also, there are a lot of indicia of ownership requirements where under ERISA, the indicia of ownership has to be maintained within the United States, federal court's jurisdiction. You have to report fair market value in a pretty particular way. Again, IRAs, the custodian has to hold the assets. That has to be a U.S. bank. So we need to figure out a lot of stuff, like what is the indicia of ownership, and those kinds of questions in this world. And, they haven't updated the indicia of ownership regulations since the 80s. So that doesn't cover almost any financial product or transaction that's ever, and we try to work around it as best as we can, but this is new territory. So there's a lot of work to do. And I hope the Department of Labor and other regulators get on it and they work together, which as they're supposed to do.
This is so fascinating. And I love these conversations because you think they're, if perhaps it's going to be focused predominantly on the compliance or regulatory priorities, but then there's, David, to your point, there's this convergence in wealth management between managing the client's assets that are held away together with the rest of the practice. The businesses are changing, and Mahtav's talked about that as well. Anna, when it comes to separating firms from being more reactive to proactive, any thoughts as 2026 is around the corner?
Sure. I think, put simply, firms who are reactive find out that they have risks or problems in an exam or getting a subpoena, versus firms who are proactive tend to find risks in-house. And so when you're thinking about this for 2026, you're always ahead of the curve if you take that proactive compliance approach. So for example, if you have tools and controls in place, you're more likely to detect, potential misconduct or non-compliance sooner, which will in turn reduce the risk of investor harm, which will in turn reduce the risk of enforcement action. Not to mention, it's just a good thing to do for your clients. And so it may seem like additional work on the front end, but from what I have seen, not only at my time at the SEC, but even more so now in the private sector, the firms who invest those resources and time to be proactive tend to actually save time in the end.
Let's say cheers to that. Cheers to firms being on the proactive side. A couple of quick points. we're going to have a few, I'll call it takeaways from today's conversation. We're going to be creating a checklist and sharing that for folks who are going to be, who are interested in that. Once you close the Zoom window, you're going to get a prompt that's, that allows you to click to see whether you want to see either of these assets. And with that said, my time might be a minute or two early, but I wanted to sincerely thank our gracious panelists, Tom, David, Anna, Mahtab. Really appreciate you taking the time and in jumping into this conversation. It's been delightful.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.